It's my pleasure to introduce Raj Rao. Raj did his PhD in computer science from Rochester, where he studied computer vision. And then he went on to do a postdoc at the Sloan Center for Theoretical Neurobiology at the Salk Institute, working with Terry Sanyowski. So Raj has a really varied background, and he's going to talk about some neat stuff here. But the most amazing thing about Raj is I actually sent him mail inviting him to come the night before his wedding. Well, that wasn't the amazing thing. The amazing thing was he answered me. The response was something like, "I'd love to do it, get back to you soon, gotta leave, getting married tomorrow."
That was pretty much it.
So with that, why don't we get going? Raj?
Thanks, Chris. I'd like to thank the department for inviting me over. So I'll be talking today about, let me see if I can turn this off.
I have my glasses on so I can do it.
Mm-hmm. That's good. So I'll be talking today about some work that I've done in collaboration with Dana Ballard from the University of Rochester, and more recently with Terry Sanyowski at the Salk Institute. And this comprises some of the work from my PhD thesis, as well as more recent work done at the Salk. I thought I'd start by giving a brief introduction to my research interests. And they span three main areas. I started out in machine vision and machine learning, and so I'll be giving a brief example of how you can start with some inspiration from biology and then go to algorithms in machine vision, in particular active vision. And my other interest is in computational neuroscience. So I'll give an example of a case where you can start out with the computational idea and then go to neuroscience and try to explain some data that's been that hasn't been explained satisfactorily for a long time. And something I won't be talking about today, but I still have a lot of interest in, is the idea of learning online in mobile robots. And so that's something that I'd like to continue in the years to come. So the main highlight of my approach is I strongly believe in a multidisciplinary approach. So for example, you can start out with ideas from neurobiology and then try to derive algorithms for machine learning and robotics. And I'll give an example of that in the first part of my talk. And you can also go the other direction, which is you could come up with a particular problem and then devise algorithms based on statistical techniques, for example, and then try to come up with an implementation that's also neurobiologically plausible, and then try to explain data coming in from different labs, either psychophysics experiments or experiments in monkey or rats. And so here's a brief summary of some of the work that I've done along these lines. So I just put the first part up here just to say that I spent my first 2 years in grad school trying to solve the P equals NP problem, but it's a pretty dismal failure. And so I moved on to greener pastures in robotics and active vision. But it's definitely, I think, a very entertaining period of 2 years working with Lane Hemespandra up in University of Rochester. So I got interested in robotics and vision, and this was some work that I've done in those two areas, starting with building these tiny robots based on Lego and erector sets, and implementing learning algorithms, and seeing if the robot can navigate by itself through a maze, avoiding obstacles and so on. And after that, there was some work on active vision. So here's the system that we used in Rochester, based on two cameras mounted on a pan-tilt motor head. And the problems that I addressed there was, for example, how do you learn to make eye movements if you start out with a map from perceptions to actions that's not really refined, but then you give it examples of how do you capture a particular object that's moving in a particular direction, or how do you recognize and locate an object. So that was basically some work I did initially, and then more recently, I've been doing work in object recognition and in eye movements in visual search. And I'll give an example of how you can use something like the system here to solve these two tasks. And the other part of the research, going from computational algorithms back to neurobiology, I've been involved in a project to model the visual cortex in terms of an idea called predictive coding. And I'll talk a little bit about this and show how you could use this for explaining, first of all, lower level properties of neurons in the primary visual cortex, as well as higher level phenomena like attention and segmentation. These are pretty fundamental problems, not only in neuroscience, but also in computer vision. And so that's something that I'd like to get into more in my future research. And I won't be talking about the last part, which is something I've been doing with Terry, and that's temporal Hebbian learning and how you can use that for motion processing. But that's something that's being modeled at the biophysical level, a little bit lower level than these models, which are traditional neural network type models. So to motivate the research I'll be spending the first half of the talk on, here's an example from a very classical experiment from the Russian scientist called Yarbus. And this was done in the 1960s. And the experiment here was the subject was presented with an image such as this one. And this one's a painting called The Unexpected Visitor. And the subject was asked to ask different kinds of questions. For example, in this case here, so what's shown here are the eye movements of that particular subject. When the subject was asked, estimate the ages of the persons in this particular room. And so you'll notice that there's a very a stereotypical pattern of eye movements the subject makes. For example, you tend to have a lot more eye movements that are concentrated on the faces of these people in the room, and not that many eye movements made to other parts of the scene. Whereas if you ask the subject, remember the clothing that the person is wearing, remember the clothes, you find these types of eye movements where you have a lot more of these scanning movements along the clothes of the object, of the person. And for example, in the last case, if you ask, estimate how long the unexpected visitor has been away, then you see a lot more of these back and forth eye movements just to estimate the types of emotions being shown by the people. And so this gives you an idea of how versatile the human visual system is in terms of exploiting eye movements to actually solve a particular task at hand. So there's no, it doesn't appear that there's a very general pattern of eye movements that a person makes for a given image, but rather the types of eye movements you make are geared towards solving specific tasks. And so from a computational point of view, one might ask the question, can you devise an architecture that can be used for solving tasks based on visual routines? And so here's a particular task-specific decomposition of visual tasks. So for example, if you divide an image into different components of the image, and then you have certain stored models in your computer vision system, then you can come up with this sort of a dichotomy between the identification problem, or what, and the location problem, or where. So in this case, you have many components in the image. So that's this cartoon over here. And you're trying to locate an object. So for example, this particular person in this particular image here. And so the computer vision system has to search across the entire image for a particular match of this particular stored model. And I'm just depicting this as an image here, but in principle, you'd like to have a more sophisticated model of the object. And the complementary problem is if you have something in the center of your camera, you'd like to find out what that particular object is, and that's called the what, or the identification problem. And so in general, with these two types of routines, one can compose general behaviors that are related to interpreting a particular scene depending on what the particular task is at hand. And the inspiration for this type of a division of labor for solving tasks comes partly from neurobiology. So if you look at the visual cortex, what's shown here is the stream of information flow from the back of your brain, and that's the primary visual cortex, or V1. And the information proceeds along two distinctive pathways, one going through up to the back of your head, and that's called the dorsal stream, and that's primarily responsible for spatial vision, or the where in our previous slide. And the other one is going up to near your ears, and that's the infratemporal stream, or the ventral stream. And so that's depicted by this diagram here, where you have information from the retina, your eyes, going up to what's called the lateral geniculate nucleus, and then different visual areas in the cortex. And one of them is primarily responsible for computing motion and spatial relationships between objects. And the other stream seems to be concerned more with form, color, and other aspects of the visual world that are concerned with the what question, as shown here. So this actually gives you a little bit of insight as to how one might go about building a general architecture for vision based on how evolution has come up with these neuroanatomical constraints for solving certain visual tasks. One might ask, what exactly is the representation you want to use for using these types of visual routines? And if you look at the representation down in these visual areas, for example, in primary visual cortex, the representation is in terms of different angular, different spatial filters that are oriented at different locations. So these are sensitive for edges. So for example, here's a classic slide from the Nobel Prize winning work of Hubel and Wiesel going back to 1962. And what they've shown is that if you record from monkeys and you expose them to bars or lines at different orientations, then it turns out that the neurons are sensitive towards bars at different orientations or edges at different orientations. And these are characterized by these types of profiles, the so-called receptive fields of the neuron. And the neuron fires, the nerve cell fires the maximum when you have a particular bar that's dark and is flanked by bright regions of space in the surrounding regions. And so we decided to test this as a representation for computer vision. And so here's the idea. It's a very simple idea. It's to characterize images. For example, a local image region here near the eye of this person you all well know. And it's basically to characterize it in terms of these spatial filters. And these are essentially negative values are represented by dark and positive values by the brighter regions. And so this particular filter is going to be sensitive towards an edge that's in the horizontal orientation. This would be sensitive to an edge that's in the vertical orientation. And this would be sensitive to a dark bar that's localized and that's horizontal in orientation, so on. And so given an image, you come up with a long high-dimensional vector that's of this form, and the negative quantities are downwards, positive, or upwards. And this can be looked upon as a iconic representation or a response vector representation of a local image region. And so if you use this as a way of representing objects based on entirely their images and not really any three-dimensional models, then you can devise routines for locating objects and for recognizing objects. So here's the diagram for example, for locating objects, the so-called WHERE algorithm. So given a particular image, you can come up with a multiple scale representation of the image, and that's called a pyramid, and that's shown here for 5 different sizes of the image. And then that can be convolved with the 9 filters we have, and then in turn gives you a representation of the image in terms of the spatial filter representation, and that's given by this box here. And so to find an object, you simply compute the distances or correlations between your stored response vector and the vectors for all the different locations in the image. And what comes out of it is a so-called saliency map. So it tells you which locations in the image are likely to contain the object that you're searching for. And that's given by, in this case, a peak over here. The bright region represents a peak in the saliency map. And then you simply compute a motor command to move the eyes towards that location in the visual space. And that is continued in a recurrent fashion. And so that gives you a way of finding objects. And then given an object, you can do the complementary problem, which is to recognize it in terms of these filter representations. So that's given by this diagram here. So given a particular object that's in the center of your gaze, you can then compare it to different stored models of faces in your memory, and then come up with the winner-take-all type algorithm that tells you which of these particular objects, each of these rows is one particular object, or in this case a face, which of those corresponds best to this particular object that's being given as input to the system. And so that's the 2 complementary routines, one for finding objects and one for identifying something at the center of gaze. And so I'll give you an example of these 2 in the video here. Turn on. Do you need to rewind it? Rewind it. Let's turn on. It's not turned on though. Yeah, I think. Just hold on a minute.
I have one.
You can turn this around, maybe you could. Oh, there we go. Okay, so let me rewind that. Okay, so what you see here is the Activision head. Basically, this is showing the tilting movements, and that's based on a motor that's at the back. And then you'll see the panning movements that you can use for making eye movements. And these are pretty fast eye movements that you can make up to 300 degrees per second. What I'll show next is an example of how you might be able to find a particular object. In this case, it's a scene containing a particular robotic arm. And it's kind of hard to see here. There's actually a representation of that scene. And then you make an eye movement, and then the problem is to find back the original location. And so it's actually a little bit hard to see in this one. But what you'll see is a comparison, and then what you'll end up doing is finding the location going back to the center, and that's the center. It's going to be more clear in the next one, I think, in the next example. So here's an example where I've written some letters on a board, and the computer is trying to recognize, it's trying to count the number of A's, the letter A's on the scene. And this is a representation in terms of the spatial filters and multiple scales for an A, for the letter A. And given this representation, the problem is to count the number of A's. And so it'll try to find the most likely match for an A in the scene. And the peak turns out to be all the white regions. And it initially goes to the one that's the highest peak in that saliency map. So here in this case, it was this location here. And so it makes an eye movement to that location. And you have something called an inhibition of return. So you want to avoid going back to the same location because you're counting those objects. And so you inhibit that location by setting that to 0. And then you come up to the next highest peak in the saliency map. And so it comes to the next location, and so on. So what you'll see here is a gradual, it'll go to a particular location. It'll inhibit that location, and then find the next peak, and then go back to that location, and so on. So that's an example of how you might be able to use this particular algorithm for locating objects or for counting and so on. Here's the opposite example where you want to learn models of objects based on just their appearance. So this is the what problem. So here I'm giving the computer different views of a particular three-dimensional object. And for each of these views, it's memorizing the representation of the object in terms of those spatial filters. And so every view gets its own representation. And so an object itself is being characterized as a manifold in this three-dimensional space. So it's in terms of a very high-dimensional vector representation. And as you'll see, these are all scale normalized. So that's the reason why it's expanding and contracting. So you're making sure that the object fits within the size of the image. And once you have these training views of the object, one can then proceed to test the system on novel views of the object. So for example, if I give it a view that it hasn't seen before, but that lies between two training views, like this one, it can come up with the best guess or the closest match, and that's this one here. And so this system generalizes to views that are up to 10 degrees apart in terms of training views. This is actually a silly example where I just gave it something that wasn't in the training set, and it just gets lucky and finds this. But in general, it can be fooled if you give it things that are not close enough to its training set. You can then apply this also to the problem of face recognition. And in this case, it was different people from the graduate students in the computer science department. And they were just asked to make different facial expressions. And the computer was being trained on different points on the facial locations in this particular image. And so it comes up with a high-dimensional representation of these different views, or different expressions of the persons. And then I'll test it on views that are of these people where they were asked to make facial expressions that were novel, so some combination of these training facial expressions. And the goal is to see if it generalizes over facial expressions. And so that was the example of the training set. And then here's the results. If I give it a particular training view, it'll come up with some canonical view of this particular person. So in this case, that was and it comes up with a name and so on. The same thing with another example of that person. And then it comes up with the canonical expression of that person. And then finally, once again, I can trick it by giving something that it hasn't seen before. And in this case, it was this image here. And then it comes up with, it tries to match it, and if it falls below a threshold, then it doesn't know who it is. And so it can come up with the closest view of that particular person, in this case, this person here. And that person was pretty flattered by that comparison. So,
ask you a couple questions.
Sure.
One question is about this eye feedback thing. It wasn't clear to me when the camera goes and looks more closely at that part where it thinks it might have a match. Does it then get a new view and it's higher resolution or something, and that
Right.
helps it and
Right.
be more accurate the second
Right, so I didn't show it here, but we had a Ocular Map on the system where if you actually, the central part of the image is actually at the highest resolution, and then everything else is contracted, so it's at a lower resolution. And so that really makes sense when you have these types of camera systems where you're trying to reduce the computational burden since you're reducing the size of the image. And at the same time, you want to make sure that you can recognize the entire image and don't have just low resolution parts of the image. And so
that was part of the
right, that's the underlying assumption.
inspired or
Right.
inspired kind of.
That's right. Yeah. So if you consider humans, we have a very high resolution fovea, and then the resolution decreases as you go towards the periphery. And so that's one of the reasons people have said that we exploit eye movements is to make sure that we get high resolution information in the center.
Another question is about those oriented filters that are neurologically inspired. Did you show that they do a better job in recognition than other filters you might use?
Oh yeah, that's
wavelets or other kinds.
So that's a good question, and that actually gets me to the next part of the talk, which is learning. So can you learn better filters? So here's what we did before, right? So we took an image, and we just went through a feed-forward pass, and we said, hey, this looks like what biology is using, so why not just use them, and then let's see how we do. But then you can ask the complementary question that you just asked, which is, are these really the optimal set of filters for these kinds of images, or can we do better? And so that gives rise to this idea of coming up with a probabilistic model, a statistical model for images. And so here's the underlying idea that's been used, I think, a lot in the last couple of years for all kinds of different image processing or image recognition algorithms, which is this idea of a generative model. So you'd like to learn a set of basis functions or these basis filters that can be linearly combined in this way, and then that can give rise to an image patch. And so if you think of this as the traditional computer vision problem of analysis, solving an inverse problem, this is sort of like a computer graphics idea, which is that you're generating an image given some basis functions and some coefficients for those basis filters. And so given this model, it's possible to frame this in an optimization framework. So I have a particular image here, and it's being generated by a matrix times a vector. And so the matrix contains, the columns of this matrix contain these different filters as the columns of the matrix. And then you're asking whether I can learn these filters, which are the matrix U, and also the representation R for a particular given image. And so here's how you might, one way of actually formalizing this. So given an image, I'll call that IFT. It's a vector of pixel values at some time t. I'm going to reconstruct that in terms of a set of basis filters, the U matrix, times some vector which contains the coefficients or the weighting values for those basis filters that are in this matrix U. And then there's some nonlinear function you might want to use to actually transform it to get the image. And then there's an additive noise component. And the reason why I have this is to formalize this in terms of a maximum likelihood type framework where I can say that I'm trying to maximize the probability of generating a particular image set. And so that's called the generative model. And so this is something that defines how an image is being generated using a set of basis functions and some coefficients for those basis functions. And then the second part that you can add to this is to add some dynamics to it. So I've been talking about static images so far, but then you might imagine the case where you have time-varying images. And so the representation itself, this R vector here, is a function of time, and that's given by this recurrent relationship. So at any time instant t, I'm going through a matrix, it's a recurrent matrix called V, and then that's giving rise to a new representation here, R time t plus delta t. And I have, once again, a noise term there to give me a probabilistic interpretation of this equations here. And so the goal is to find, for a given image, IFT, find the best representation of the image in terms of these two matrices, these two representations of the entire image set. The U is a set of filters that we used previously, and then V is something that captures the dynamics of the input. And so this actually relates to something in engineering called Kalman filtering and just linear dynamical systems. So this is a very standard hidden Markov model type characterization of this problem. So there's a Markov component to it, and then there's a hidden component to it. So the hidden part is going from the hidden state to the input space, and then this is the Markov part where you're going through a Markov dynamics for your internal hidden state. And so that's another relationship you could exploit to engineering, if you wish. And then here's an example of what you might try to minimize, and it's simply the prediction errors, the squared prediction errors. So IFT is the input, and then this is your prediction of what the input should be based on your matrix U and your internal representation of the image. And so you can minimize this error by, for example, doing gradient descent. So just take the derivative of this optimization function with respect to either u or the vector r, and then that gives rise to a learning rule for the matrix u, and also a very fast network dynamics for this vector r. And that's what we're going to do, which is simply,
So in this slide, you're talking about finding the optimal coefficients R, given an image in a set of filters. But in the slide before, I thought you were talking about something else which sounded pretty intriguing, which was finding the optimal filters for an image database.
Right. So that's what
different thing, right?
So what I'm doing here is, for a given image, I'll have an optimal R, but then for a given data set, I'm going to try the optimal U for the entire data set. And so it's not just for a single image, but for the entire set of images. For example, if I give it natural images, then for every image, I'm going to adapt this matrix U by a certain amount, but then that'll accumulate over a long term, or many examples of images. And so what it ends up doing is it learns the best possible filters for that entire image set.
So the notion of optimality there is simply an average of
Right. So that's an online, it's a stochastic gradient descent, if you want to call it. That's an online learning algorithm. And so it's an average of all the different steps, all the different learning parts that every...
But what you're minimizing is the prediction error for all the images.
Right. So here's the actual equations themselves. So these are just differential equations that you can solve by your standard favorite numerical analysis method. So essentially, a learning rule for the matrix U that depends on the error in your prediction, and then there's a learning rule for the dynamics V that depends on the error in your temporal dynamics. And then there's the dynamics of the network itself. So this is how, for a given image, here's how I'll update the representation over time at every time step. And so that's given by this equation here. And so the main thing to keep track of is this intuition here, which is that whenever I give you a new image, my representation of that image is going to be a recurrent prediction, which is this here. It's a prediction of what I expect to see in the next time step, plus some gain term, which are these terms over here, times the prediction error. So at every time step, I'm correcting myself using this prediction error term, and then I'm actually weighting that according to this gain term. And notice that it depends on the variance, the inverse variance of the noise in the model. So the more noise there is in the inputs, the less I'm going to listen to my inputs, and the more I'm going to listen to the prediction itself of the internal model.
When you say time step, are you talking about if there's kind of a video sequence, or are you talking about for a single image, there's an iterative process for
It's both. So if I'm just giving it static images, then it's an iterative process where it converges to. So for example, I don't need to use this matrix V if I'm just concerned with static images, maybe of faces, or so there it becomes an iterative process, and it converges to some representation that's stable for one particular image. But then if I give it a set of images that are in time, then I can learn this additional matrix V that tells me how to predict the next image given the past history of images.
So do many iterations on each frame and then go to the next frame, or do you sort of iterate just once in each frame?
Here it's just once. In the experiments I've done so far, it's just once. So you actually take into account the current image, try to predict the next one, and once you get that image, you take the difference between that image. So I actually have I think it'll become clear with this diagram here. So here's the general diagram for this type of model. So at any time step, you're making some prediction of what that input should be, and then you're using that error signal to correct yourself in this predictive estimator part. So that's given by these. So these are matrices that we had in the previous equation. So there's a transpose here of the same matrix, and I'm calling that the feed-forward matrix because it's in this pathway. And then there's a feedback component that this is basically the synthesis part. The analysis part is here, the synthesis part is here, and then this is the internal representation of what the input should be. And this is the recurrence for generating the next input given my current error signal. And so that's the general idea, is to go through this recurrence. And for a static image, I don't have this part here. I just have the feed forward and then feedback, feed forward and feedback. Whereas for a dynamic set of input images where I have an input sequence, I'm also going through this recurrence to predict what the next image should be. And so you might ask the question, what exactly do you get if I give different types of input to this network? So for example, if I give it a set of natural images, do I get in these matrices here, do I get a representation that resembles what you see in the primary visual cortex? Because presumably evolution has tuned up our brain to be tuned more towards natural images than, for example, some arbitrary random noise images. And so that's a very good hypothesis of perhaps how the visual system has developed its representations, is perhaps by making it optimal for natural images. And so we actually did that experiment, and it's been done by several different people using different types of algorithms. And here's what you get. So you go back to square one. You go back to the types of filters we had before. So if you take these types of natural images and look at only tiny windows like this, so you extract patches of these images and feed it to the network, then after about 10 to 20,000 different examples of these types of tiny patches, it turns out that the network learns these types of edge detectors and bar detectors and so on at different orientations. And the interpretation is that this is the best way of representing a small local patch in a natural image in terms of that particular predictive coding type algorithm. And this also relates to some work being done in blind source separation and in independent component analysis. And the idea is that you'd like to have a representation that's very sparse. So only a few neurons are firing at any time. Only a few of these components are active at any time. And so if you add that constraint to this network, then you get a slightly different set of basis functions. And these are very localized wavelet type or Gabor filter type representations. And these are optimal given this constraint that you have only a few of these units active at any time. And this is actually very useful for compression. So if you're doing image compression, then you'd like to have only a few bits to send. And so this might be a very good representation. That might, some people are testing this as a better way of representing images than wavelets, for example, which are fixed, whereas these are adaptive to the current image set that you have. So this is something that, that prompted us to ask, can we actually learn something that's more complex or more hierarchical in the sense that can you go beyond just a tiny patch in an image and start learning features that are capturing the statistics of larger portions of the image? And the goal here is to relate this to the architecture of the visual cortex. So the visual cortex is a hierarchical system, and each level seems to be coding for more and more complex features. And so what we were asking was whether you can learn features and then compare them to the properties of neurons, for example, in the second area of the visual cortex. And so here's the natural way of extending this idea. And so instead of just using one level to make predictions, you can actually have a second level that's looking at the properties of the first level or the representation of the first level and then making predictions about that. And then it's learning based on this higher order property. So it's a higher order learning system. And here's an example of it applied to a set of images. So if you have 3 tiny image patches and you have 3 of these modules, these predictive estimator modules, looking at a local image patch, and the second level turns out to be, is looking at something that's a combination of these 3 responses at the first level. And so it's actually predicting something about the entire image right here. So it's actually learning features about what extends beyond a local region in an image. And so it's a way of getting higher order statistics about an image based on these lower level modules. And in principle, this can be extended to many different levels until you span the entire image that you have at a particular resolution of the image. And it also relates to ideas in computer vision. For example, the idea of having a pyramid representation of the image where you have multiple scales, information at multiple scales. And the idea here is that as you go higher and higher up, you're learning increasingly abstract representations of the input that you're getting. And so maybe you're looking at larger spatial scales, and you're also looking at longer temporal scales. And so the information is getting more and more abstracted away from the actual input itself. And the overlying idea here is that this is the way that images are actually being generated in the physical world. It's by some form of interactions that are occurring at a multiple scale level.
What's the form of the predictive estimators at the various levels? Is it always
It's always the same. So that's another interesting idea is that people have noticed that if you look at the cortex in general, then the architecture of the cortex is very much similar across different modalities. It doesn't matter if you're looking at the visual cortex or the auditory cortex. It appears as if the same pattern of connections seem to be dominant across different modalities. And so the idea here is that we would like to reuse the same component, but the difference is that the inputs are different and the outputs are different, but the same algorithm is being used at multiple levels and also perhaps in multiple modalities.
I'm a little confused about what happens at level 2 versus level 1.
Okay.
Is level 2 looking at a lower resolution version of the level 1 things gamed together, so you basically have a larger area of the image at lower resolution?
Right. So the level 2 does not get to look at the image itself, but it's actually looking at the response or the representation at each of these. So let's suppose you had the vector r, right, in my previous slide, the coefficients for predicting the images. So you'd have 3 of those vectors here, and the second level is actually trying to predict those 3 vectors all at the same time. So it's a conjunction of those 3 vectors. It's in principle learning how a particular local image region generates responses here at the first level. So it's a way of encoding a larger image area, the correlations over extended spatial scales, but at the higher level. So it's looking at a different level of abstraction from the first level. The first level is the image level. The second level is the level of edge detectors and edges of different orientations and so on. And so it's looking at how that changes over time and how that.
So looking at correlations in this transform space.
Right, exactly, right. And so here's the, if you repeat the same experiment but with these two-level networks, then you end up with higher level features that start looking like different combinations of these types of features. And the interpretation is that these are the types of features that tend to co-occur most often in, for example, if you have this as a second level. So you have 3 of these first level images being stacked together, and that represents each of these patches here. So these are the kinds of features that are dominant in natural images for these types of representations. And so you can ask the question now as to, does this really give you anything? I mean, in terms of, for example, does it explain any interesting data in neurobiology? Because that was one of the motivations for coming up with this hierarchy, was to see if you can explain some complex properties in the visual cortex. And so
So what you're showing in level 2 is level 2
projected back to the first.
to the image, so it's
Right.
a combination of level 1 and
Right. So we asked the question of whether this two-level network can then be used for explaining certain properties in the visual cortex that seem to have been not explained sufficiently before. So for example, I'm just going to give you one example of this here. And this is a very simple property that might seem puzzling at first. So what's shown here is something called NStopping. So if you flash or if you move a bar in the activation region of a neuron in the visual cortex, in primary visual cortex, so in this case, somebody's moving this bar in this direction here, and this represents the activation region, the region where the cell responds the most, then you get a response, and these are given by these spikes or these pulses that the neuron emits for a particular stimulus. Then you get the most response when you straddle this activation region, which is shown here, and so you get a very vigorous response. But then as you extend the stimulus, this bar, beyond this activation region, then you start getting lesser and lesser responses until you get no response at all for a very long bar. And so even though the same stimulus is actually straddling here and here, the only thing that's different between this and this case here is the fact that there's something in the surrounding context. So there's a context here in terms of a bar that's in the same orientation as the central bar that's causing a very large reduction in the response. And so here's the depiction of this in a quantitative fashion. So as you increase the length of the bar, that's this axis here, you get an initial increase in response and then you get a decrease in response. And here's the mapping of this type of a model to the visual cortex. So here's the retina, and then there's something called the lateral geniculate nucleus, which is a first station in visual processing. And then you have 2 different visual areas, V1 and V2, that are depicted here, V1 and V2. And then there's these feedback connections that go from a higher cortical area to a lower one back to this LGN. And so there's a lot of questions about what exactly are these feedback pathways doing. So the traditional view of the visual cortex is that it's a primarily feed-forward system where you give an image and information just propagates through to the higher areas. And there's been a long-standing open problem of what exactly are these feedback connections doing in visual perception. And so what this model suggests is that the feedback connections are ideally suited for carrying these predictions or expectations of the input image. And so the feed-forward pathways are only carrying the error signals or the differences in the prediction and the image. And if you believe in this model, then you can start explaining why you get these types of responses from cortical neurons. So here's the comparison to the biology if you have that kind of a mapping from the model to the neuroanatomy. So what's shown on the left is the type of response you get for one of these error-detecting neurons, or these the errors that you get when you have a bar length of a particular length and you increase the length of the bar. And so you get an initial increase in response and you get a decrease in response as you increase the length of the bar. And the same thing happens in a visual cortical neuron that is shown here. And the interesting thing is that if you remove feedback, there's no predictions coming in. And so there's no context to predict the central bar. And so you get a very large response because this is the error. There's a very large error in the network because there's no feedback. And so there's no prediction of the bar. And the same thing happens in a cortical neuron when you inactivate a particular layer in the visual cortex. And that's interpreted here as being an activation of feedback. And so finally, here's the interpretation of why this might be happening from purely a computational perspective. So if you look at any region in a natural image, and you look at the orientation of any features in the natural image, you'll find that for any central region here, the surrounding region tends to have the same orientation. There's a very high probability that this orientation continues in that same direction in the surrounding region. So that's given here for vertical, horizontal, and diagonal. And these are just the autocorrelations in those particular directions. And so there's a much higher autocorrelation along that orientation than in the opposite orientation. And so this gives you an explanation for why you find that phenomenon of NStopping, because anytime you have something in the surrounding context that can predict the center, the network has a very low error signal. There's no errors. The error is almost zero because the surrounding context predicts a vertical edge whenever there's a vertical edge in the surround. And so basically, you end up with very low responses in the neurons, essentially because the statistics of natural images are such that you have dominant orientations along those directions if you pick any part of a natural image. And so the visual system has learned to represent this part of the statistics of images in its network. And so you don't have to convey that part of the statistics anymore, and you just convey the errors in the prediction. And so that's one way of interpreting data based on a purely a computational and a statistical perspective, and exploiting the statistics of natural images. You can go beyond this and ask, can you also explain some higher level phenomena? For example, how does the visual system do attention? Or for example, how does it segment objects when you have multiple objects in a given image? And so here's how you could actually formalize that problem in terms of this predictive coding idea of having predictions and error signals. And so suppose I train a network on these two objects, and so these two are the only objects that this network is familiar with. Then you have these potential problems. So if I give it an image containing an original object, but also these surrounding objects that are not part of the training image, then you basically have the problem that when you make a prediction, there's going to be large parts of the image that don't match your prediction of the object. The same case here, you have both of these objects present, but it can only predict one or the other. So which one is it going to predict? And so you can actually handle this problem by using something from robust statistics. So this is a field where it gives you tools for recognizing outliers, statistical outliers in your data, and for rejecting those outliers in your predictions. So here's the actual formalization of this problem. So the idea is to give less weight to your high prediction errors, and those are essentially parts of the image that contain outliers. And so initially we had the squared error optimization function, which is a quadratic function, but then now you can modify this to actually reject parts of the image that contain very large errors. And so this is basically a robust optimization function. It rejects any of the parts of the image that have large errors that are beyond a particular value C here. And that's given by this particular term that's added on to the optimization function. And so here's the result. So in the first case, where you had a particular image and you had the surrounding objects in the background, the network essentially, after it iterates over several iterations, it ends up with a prediction and some outliers here. And here's the network itself. So I've just added on one particular part to this network, which is detecting any large errors that are present in the predictions and then filtering them out. So it's basically ignoring those parts of the image, which are these parts here, that have very large prediction errors, and letting through only those that are consistent with its predictions. In this case, this object here. And the second case is more interesting, where you have both objects present, and here it ends up predicting one and ignoring the other, and then it goes back and it can actually you can actually mask the image and then try to predict the remaining part of the image. And this is analogous to the problem of segmentation, where you have multiple objects in the scene and you'd like to focus attention on one object or the other and then recognize sequentially different parts of the image. So I'll give you an example of this happening in the video. Okay. So this gives you a better idea of the dynamics of the network as it's running. I think it's not. Okay. Okay, so here are the two training objects that I just had in my previous slide. And then the first example is the case where there were objects in the foreground and also in the background. And what I'll show here is the predictions of the network over time. So you'll initially see a very bad prediction. And what's shown here are the outliers, or parts of the image that it's ignoring as it's trying to estimate this object. So you'll see gradually that it learns that these are parts of the image that are outliers. And so it essentially filters them out and doesn't take them into consideration when it's trying to make this prediction and error correction cycle. And so it ends up with treating these as the outliers. And so you end up with a much better prediction of the image. And that's given by this here. In the second example, it contains both the training objects. And so here's the image containing both the training objects. And initially, it does some linear combination of both of these objects, but doesn't know which of these objects it's actually estimating. But then gradually, one of them fades into the background. So that's given by this here. So the second object is treated as an outlier. And the first one is being estimated in this current iteration. And so this object gradually fades into the background, and it only has one object that it recognizes. And so given that particular recognition, it can then switch attention, which is the analog for how one might go about looking at different objects. And it can move its gaze now to the second object. So you take this and you mask it onto the first image, and that's given by this here. And it can come up with a prediction of what this remaining object is. And that's given by this particular image here. And so that's one way of implementing this form of attention, or this form of segmentation, by sequentially estimating one object after the other, and then focusing attention on one or the other based on this idea of robust filtering or robust statistics. The last example I have is the extension of this to the dynamic case, where you have an image sequence containing a sequence of 6 different images, and it's a cyclic sequence. So you go back from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and back to 0. And the network has been trained on these types of, on this particular image sequence. And then I'll give it examples of a sequence containing different types of objects that are placed in the foreground or the background. And initially, it does a very bad job of predicting. So it needs several iterations before it can then prune away the parts of the image that contain outliers. So these are the parts of the image that it thinks contain occluders and so on. And so it can ignore those occluders and then start predicting, again, the original sequence. And that's given by this here. So it's a way of recovering from noise and other forms of disruptions to the image sequence by having this idea of robust filtering that's attached onto the original predictive coding network. So I think that's good enough. So I'd like to basically summarize the things I've talked about so far. So my initial work was in active vision, object recognition, face recognition. That's something that I gave an example of. And I've shown how you could actually use a model based on this idea of hierarchical predictive coding, and how one might be able to relate that to the neurobiology. And also gave some examples of how you might be able to extend this type of a model for attention and segmentation and so on. What I haven't talked about is this very important problem of how do you deal with transformations in your input. So for example, if you rotate an image, or if you move an object and you have scaling in the object, or translations in the object. And it turns out that there's a very easy way of extending this type of a model to the case where you have transformations by having another network that's looking at just the transformations itself. And it turns out that that relates to Lie group theory. So this is a field where you look at continuous transformations in the inputs. And we've actually shown that you can, given just examples of 2 images of before and after a transformation, you can learn the corresponding Lie group for that particular transformation. And so that's something that I'd like to pursue further in terms of characterizing that in more detail. And also, you can...
Are those all 2D transformations?
Yeah, those are all affine transformations. So the open question there is, can you actually learn from just examples more complex transformations, for example, 3D transformations and so on. I've also haven't talked about the idea of the idea of sequence learning. So I gave you an example of how you can learn sequences, but it turns out that you can once again go down to the level of neuroscience, and you can show that these types of algorithms are very useful for detecting motion, and in particular the direction of motion. And there's neurons in the visual cortex that are sensitive to the direction of motion. And this type of a model gives you a way of showing how learning algorithms give rise to what is called direction selectivity in the primary visual cortex. And this involves some collaboration with people doing neurophysiology of awake monkeys and so on. And so I'd like to conclude by giving some possible directions for future research. So I'd like to continue this work on dynamic vision, which is the idea of using dynamical systems, and in particular nonlinear dynamical systems, and how that can be applied for learning sequences of images and so on. And also, I'd like to extend this idea to the idea of hierarchical spatiotemporal representations. And so that's something that I haven't really pursued in depth, but I'd like to in the future. And in terms of computational neuroscience, I'd like to look more at the idea of spike timing-based computation. And this might be something that I might be able to collaborate with Chris and other people in neuroscience. And also looking at statistical models of data coming from neurobiology or psychology. And I must add that I had a really good time yesterday talking with people over at the neurobiology and behavior program. And I think there was a lot of potential for possible collaborations with people there. And finally, I'd like to perhaps at some stage look at the implementation of these ideas on mobile robots, and in particular test these architectures for active vision on robots, and also look at possible algorithms for navigation. So this is some work I did in Rochester, but I haven't been able to do in the last couple of years. But it definitely would be a very interesting way of testing algorithms for sensory motor learning in mobile robots. That's essentially a brief summary of some of the things that I might pursue in my lab. So thank you for your attention.